Welcome, everybody, to episode 4 of the Lowdown on Low Code. I'm Ryan Duguid, your host, joined by my co-host, Rob Koplowitz, today. And we have a fascinating guest, a good friend, long-term mentor of Rob's. I get the honor of introducing Merv Adrian to the audience. Merv has a storied career in the world of analyst, from Gartner to Forrester to Giga Research. And today, fascinated to have a conversation about the way analyst research is carried out, the applicability of analyst research to vendor selection, and what that world looks like, both from the perspective of the analyst side, as well as from the vendor side, where I've enjoyed the luxury of interacting with these organizations and filling in their fantastic questionnaires to help you figure out how you should think about your technology choices. So Merv, great to have you on the show today.
Delighted to be here. And I guess I'm a little unique if we're going to talk about waves and magic quadrants, because I had a significant hand in helping to design the wave, its second version, and then went on to write a decade and a half's worth of magic quadrants at Gartner. So I know both processes pretty well, although I'm sure it's evolved at Forrester, and Rob will know more about that than I do. So.
Hey, fantastic. And Rob, we had the pleasure of meeting over these documents, the fantastic Forrester Wave, and maybe get a little bit of your perspective just to kick things off on that process.
Well, first off, just a quick question for Merv. Merv, how many ballpark, finger in the wind, how many MQs did you do?
I'd say a dozen. Just one a year.
Okay.
Important to know that there are companion documents that go with the Magic Quadrant document, and they're equally sizable. I'll talk about that a little bit more as we get into the details. They're called critical capabilities.
I did. By my best count, I did 30 waves in the time I was at Forrester. And for those of you who might be listening on the client side or the vendor side, Merv and I are each like 27 years old. The reason we look like this is going through the wave.
No, wait, you're being dyslexic again. I'm 72, not 27.
Oh, shoot, you're 72. All right. But these are I can only speak from the Forrester side. By the way, I wore my Forrester swag today, bold at work. Thank you, George, for the swag. I actually thought it said bald at work. I was excited. I thought that was going to be our catchphrase, but it turns out it's bold at work. But these things are extraordinarily difficult pieces of research to produce. I think they are outstanding pieces of research. And I think they are potentially often misused in the market or misunderstood in the market. So a lot of what we want to kind of get to today is how you should think about using these in your product selection processes. You'll notice that we have not on the podcast as of yet had any vendors. And that's because we've been waiting to have Merv on so we could have this conversation and then set up how we address these questions with the vendors. Because
set up the vendors or set up how we address.
We want
we
want the vendors to answer some very specific questions, and we think that lines up with the conversation we're having today about how to use this evaluative research. By the way, Ryan did not necessarily introduce himself entirely properly and his role in this. So Ryan is the vendor.
I have Rob. I'll answer it. The gray hairs, each one here is from a wave or a magic quadrant. And while you guys had the luxury of being in one analyst firm doing one per year, I had the joy of working with all the analyst firms doing each one of theirs per year. So I've lost count. And so that's my background in this.
But
listen, if you're looking for sympathy from us, just remember,
All right, Ryan.
No, forget it.
We're here. You've always wanted to do this. Hold our feet to the fire.
Yeah. Well, it's fantastic. Well, to kick it off, Merv, I think I'll play the classic. So I'm looking to buy some software. I love low-code software. I'm not sure which one I should pick. The obvious answer is going to be I grab your magic quadrant and I go with the leader. That's how I make my decisions. How do you feel about that?
Well, don't do that. And Forrester will say the same thing. Don't pick the upper right dot and just say, good, we're finished. Because that's absolutely the wrong answer. Both firms, Rob can corroborate this, both firms will tell you that reading a piece of research is the start of the process. The intent is that you then connect with an analyst who covers the space and discuss how that research applies to you, your specific requirements, your business objectives, the environment that you operate in, All of those things are variables. All an analyst can do is target some sort of average deployment requirements, business objectives, and as one of my our close friends from the early days at Giga would say, Chip Gleedman would say,
Oh.
nobody should aspire to be average. That should not be your starting point. So, it is the beginning of a process. And I'll add one other thing on behalf of the Gartner document. The Gartner Magic Quadrant is not about products. It's about companies. There is a companion document called the Critical Capabilities Report, which is specific to the products and includes significant amounts of information about the criteria on which the products were evaluated and how they scored. There is a lot more that isn't seen. But if you're going to talk about a product, looking at the Magic Quadrant is only one of the places to go. And I would argue not the best place to go unless the product specifically from the vendor that you're looking at is in fact not in the Critical Capabilities Report. And in an era where leading vendors like AWS, for example, has 17 different database products, for example, Gartner covers 2 of those in its associated Critical Capabilities reports. The other 15 aren't written about. The perspective on AWS as a vendor is across the whole portfolio, but obviously the level of detail for any given report is going to be associated with the critical capabilities they wrote as a companion for that report. So if you're looking for one they didn't cover, all the more reason why you need to get the analyst on the phone and say, well, I need to talk about time stream and you wrote about Dynamo, for example. So sorry to go on at such length there.
No. So the critical capabilities piece, I think that's one part that gets super interesting. So I think, listening to your description there, on the one hand, I would say if I think about it from the vendor perspective, when the customer's evaluating the vendor, tends to be the focus is more on the critical capabilities. And to your point, a part of the MQ or a part of the wave is the vision, the strategy, the scale, the ability to execute and what have you. So if you think about the critical capabilities side of it, how, as an analyst, and question to you as well, Rob, maybe after Merv gives this perspective, as an analyst, how do you come up with those capabilities? What's informing what's important today and into the future for a given software category?
And this is where those 2 research artifacts are so inextricably linked and why it's the same team that writes both reports. The answer to the question is, it is the perspective of the analysts on what is going on in the market, what is moving the market, what are the issues of most concern to the potential buyers that defines which criteria we're going to evaluate the products against and how, in fact, they're weighted, because they are weighted. By the way, on the online version of these reports, there's a hyperlink in the upper right-hand corner for each of them to jump back and forth between them by design, of course. It's important to recognize that once you've made a decision about a market, that informs the decision about how you assess a product, and vice versa. Once you look at what's going on with products, you think about how that reflects or potentially drives changes in the market you're talking about. So these things are, in fact, considered together, and they influence one another dramatically, and they change year by year. Another long time issue that often crops up with both is, well, this is different from last year. This guy moved up and that guy moved down. And yes, but they're typically measured against one another at this point in time. There is longitudinal comparability, but the best thing you can say about this year versus last year is, the market's changed. How so? Rob, over to you.
Well, so I think that where Forrester would capture those critical capabilities is in the model, right? So the graphic is driven by a model. The model has 25 to 30 evaluation criteria. Some of them are strategic in nature, and some of them are functional in nature. So that's the 2 axes that are represented there. From a functional perspective, which I think is where a lot of the rubber meets the road, functionally, what do you need your product to do? And of course, Merv, we also weighted them, as you well know, right? What do we think are the most important ones, which may or may not be the most important ones to you as a buyer, as you're making a purchasing decision, right? So,
and both firms make it possible for the reader to change the weightings. This is more important to me than they know. Yeah, and that will reflect, because it is a data-driven visual. It will actually change the picture.
Right, and we can sort of talk about whether or not we really think that is going on out there. I have my thoughts on it, and hopefully this podcast helps people think about that in a more critical fashion. But to your question, Ryan, where do the evaluation criteria come up? They come from the last wave, right? And then we try to figure out where the market has moved, where it's going. Somewhere between that wave and the next execution of the wave, I've taken 200 to 300 inquiries on the topic, probably. I've done, some level of advisory and consulting on it. And by the way, as you would be well aware, Ryan, we go back to the vendors on the Forrester side. We would go back to the vendors and say, these are the evaluation criteria that we think are correct. Give us your input. And I have absolutely changed it based on that. I remember getting feedback from, Kofax. You're not really taking intelligent document processing as seriously as you need to be. It's super important. It needs to be part of the evaluation process. And I would vet that and say, you know what? We do need to have a stance on that. And, that goes through all of them. And we did take the vendor input very seriously. Then that was locked in, right? That was it. This is where we're evaluating it. That should be the last chance that a vendor has any input. We should all be working together to get towards objectivity there. And to your point earlier, Merv, and don't look at the wave graphic. Why do you want to buy the leader, who may or may not be the vendor that does what you need done, right? If I were buying a car and the best rated car had, amazing capabilities in snow, I'm not paying for that in California, right? but the average consumer might need to think about things. And I didn't strive to be average. I want to know what the product does to meet my specific needs. That lives in the model.
Yeah, and the criteria definition process is similar on the Gartner side. There's a note that goes out to all of the candidate vendors, because they're not all decided on yet, early in the year, that says, here are the criteria for this year, and changes that those reflect from last year, please send us your comments. There's a conversation. And when that conversation is done, an RFP goes out. In the case of the DBMS Magic Quadrant for Gartner, that thing has over 200 lines. Each line is a specific feature or function, and there are weights associated with them, and there are, here's what represents a 3, and here's what represents a 5. All of that detail is not made public. The scores are. And the scores tend to represent an aggregate over, maybe 8 or 10 individual criteria summed up into a function, to use the term you used earlier, Rob. And along with all those functional questions in the RFP are a whole bunch of other ones that are about evaluating the company, which, as I said, is what the Magic Quadrant does. So we look at the marketing organization, the selling, the pricing model. All of those other things become part of the Magic Quadrant. They're not part of the product-specific critical capabilities. So.
I think, the fascinating thing, the observation from the world of the low-code side is that Excel, to your point with the 200 lines, may or may not be the best tool for people to work with on this exercise.
Oh, you won't have to convince me about that. That's there's a reason why these documents and several other flagship documents inside Gartner are referred to by the analysts as the big rocks. It is the dominant research activity of the year to be on a Magic Quadrant and associated critical capabilities.
I'm sure you'll like this. What happens in vendor landscape is step 1, I get the Excel spreadsheet. Step 2, that goes to a team, typically. Big variances in how different companies handle this and which roles and which departments and what have you interact with it. Step 2 goes to a team of people who take last year's Excel spreadsheet and go through line by line and see which questions are the same.
Yes.
And then they copy paste everything from one cell to the other, right? And then they come to the product and say, has anything changed?
Yeah, it's fascinating to see the degree to which vendors differ in their response processes. What you just described is something that happens a lot. We often get a document that on first blush seems like they made a mistake and sent us last year's. And in other cases, there's an enormous amount of diligence to the degree that since it's Excel, you can add another column and put your own stuff in. And we get spreadsheets back, or not we anymore, but Gartner got spreadsheets back where the vendor would make very specific comments after filling out the answer to the question. This is how this changed from last year. Hey, and by the way, you scored us low on this one. We're expecting to see it better this time.
I think you were allowed to provide notes to the reviewer. I didn't realize that's a new trick in my toolkit.
That was enormously valuable when a vendor would come back and say, remember you called us out for not having XML support, last year? Well, it got added. Well, that's, you don't forget that hits your noggin, and there isn't time to discuss every feature change in the typical briefing, which is always a briefing associated with the process. Same thing is true, I know, on the Forrester side. And there's way too much to cover. So how that's organized, how you chose to prioritize it, which things you chose to feature on, obviously impact how the analyst thinks about it, but it's not complete, and that's why there's a couple of hundred lines of spreadsheet to go through.
We were very prescriptive. I mean, the process at Forrester has become tighter and tighter as time went by. As I mentioned, I did 30 over nearly 15 years. Over the last 5 years, that Wave Center of Excellence was run by our full disclosure, a very good friend of mine, Stephen Powers, and with very strong input from one of his managers, Danielle Jesse, and they tightened that process a lot in terms of how responses could take place, timing, and the scripting of the demos, right? So, in my case, I had enough latitude to say, I've got a few hours with you for you to demo the product, somewhere between, probably 2 to 3. This is what you need to show me, because these are the things that if I don't see it and I don't see exactly how it works for you, you're going to tell me it works. Yes, I have it, and I need to see it. Or if you give me that explanation in your spreadsheet, yeah, I could do that. Do you have decision modeling capabilities? Yes, of course we do. Oh, you've got like a tiny bit of conditional logic. That's not what I'm looking for, right? Show it to me and let me call BS and score it appropriately, right? So, so that's where
So you get a 1 on a scale of 5 if that's all you've got. Yeah, absolutely.
It depends on how
Gartner
valuable it is.
Doesn't use a lab.
Yeah.
Gartner does not use a lab, and it doesn't have a standardized demo. So it's a different process. On the other hand, they rely on roughly 500,000 inquiries to Gartner every year, which are all stored. And we have lots of information. And nobody ever puts in an inquiry to tell us how much they like something, obviously. So all of that information is about weaknesses, right? Problems, issues. So that's a balance. But yeah, at the end of the day, even if they're doing a demo, and even if you have all that other information, you have to rely to some degree, unless you're a lab-based company, that they're giving you accurate information. And classically, over the years, some vendors have been better at that than others in terms of the factual content that they provide.
There was always one piece which never showed up with Ryan, by the way. Actually, I can only point to a couple of instances over the 15 years and 30 waves where I was put in the position of trying to disprove a lie, which is really hard for an analyst, right? We count on it. We count on a trusted relationship with the vendors, and it's almost always the case, right? Even though.
Well, there's another interesting dimension to the relationship with vendors that happens there. When a vendor tells you in all sincerity that they have something and it works, and you have half a dozen inquiries from clients who have said, we have it and it doesn't, often that information is not well received by the vendor, but in fact, they're typically a client as well. And we're giving them something they need to hear. Sometimes they appreciate it. Depends on which part of the company you're talking to. If you're talking to the product manager, he's probably happy, or she, to learn that there's something going on out there that they may not be aware of, or maybe. If you're talking to AR, of course it works. What are you talking about?
Right.
So those can become interesting conversations. And to some degree, although these documents are not written for the vendors, they are among the largest consumers of these documents, and they're very active in their discussion with us. But the documents are not written for them. They're written for the buyers, not the sellers.
So the next question, following on from the criteria one. So I'm a vendor. I build some incredible low-code software. I'd like to go up and to the right. There's even books written about the topic, tell you how to do this. How should I think about things as a vendor? If I look at your criteria, should I be coming to you and saying, hey, what things do I need to do to go from a 1 to a 3, a 3 to a 5 in the next year? How would you respond to that type of question?
That's a very legitimate question, and it gets discussed routinely at both ends of the process. Early on, if there's a new criterion, for example, typically a vendor will respond and say, "Oh, you've added this. How are you going to? What are the things you're looking for?" And yeah, we're happy to answer that question. And at the other end of the process, the thing has come out, and I wasn't all that thrilled with my score. What would it have taken for me to have done or have in the product to have scored better there? And generally, if the analysts are good at what they do, Gartner does a couple of hundred Magic Quadrants a year across all different kinds of technology, and the standards are pretty rigorously enforced. So they should have the answer to that question. There is internally a document that says this is the criterion. These are the things that represent the middle. This is upper. This is lower. How detailed you get, I think that's going to vary by technology and it's going to vary by analyst. But there's always a model that says this is better than that. This is worse than that. And last point, I'm sorry I'm talking so much. It is somewhat relativistic. From year to year, for example, in the DBMS market, as we tracked the movement of the vendors into the cloud, some people were clearly ahead of others in one year, and by the next year, a lot of people had caught up on some of those things. But new things now were becoming more important. The most obvious example being the pricing models evolved rather dramatically over time, and so did governance, and so did the ability to configure things yourself, which in the early days, it was, I'll move to the cloud and let them do everything for me. People quickly figured out that in fact was not what they wanted. And so that more variable control became significant. And that changed year over year, and the criteria evolved, and the scores against those criteria evolved accordingly.
So, Rob, in the world of low code, if you were to take, and you'd say the last DPA wave, if you were to take all the vendors and line them up for any given score criteria, in your mind, was there a clear, so you'd score from, say, a 0 to 5, was there someone where you could say, Nintex, they're biased here, but they're a 5 on this, they're the marquee, and I'm going to use them to judge everybody else? And then maybe on some other criteria, hey, it's going to be KISS flow that's there or agile point that's there. Would you have that relativity between vendors so you could point to, hey, these people are doing this really well. Customers like this implementation.
If I didn't have what I thought was an extremely objective criteria that I was rating the vendor on, I would go through and do a ranking of the vendors on some of the criteria. And so, in most cases, it would be like, we'll pick an RPA thing. Do you have RPA support in it? Yes, we have RPA embedded in the product. You can pull it from the modeling environment, drop it in easy. It's ours. You don't have to pay anything extra for it. That was some portion of the score, but I'm a UiPath shop. Do you have pre-integration with UiPath? Yes, I can do the same thing I just described with UiPath. I want to building in anybody's product. I mean, these are all the sort of pieces of the criteria that I could build out into an objective score. And I think they were tough to argue with. I had 30 waves. I only had one escalation in all those years. Because I took this stuff very, very seriously. From the rating perspective, Reimer and I often did waves together. We had some very, very intricate spreadsheets that went through the rating process and said you were in the top third, the middle third, the bottom third, based on these criteria, which we didn't share with the market. We didn't share those support spreadsheets, but we would share them with the vendors to say, this is why you got this score. But I tried to err on the side of, I have some very objective criteria that I could expose to the customers, expose to our clients, and they can say, well, that's great. Rob rated it on this. That's not what's important to me. I have to adjust how I'm looking at this score.
There is one little subtlety on the scale, and that is that the analysts in a particular technology area have a point of view about a particular criteria and what ought to be available, and maybe nobody is doing it yet. And so it may be that on a scale of 1 to 5, literally no vendor gets a 5 on a particular criteria, because the analyst believes, and typically because the customers are saying, I need this. Nobody's delivered it yet. So somebody may be able to get a 4, maybe several people do, but nobody's getting a 5 just yet. That tends to be the dimension on which, when people talk about the entire thing shifting, the whole collection year over year, that's typically what's going on. Requirements in the market are changing and people are moving towards them at different speeds.
So Ryan,
I think that's an interesting point.
Sorry to talk over you, Ryan. In the low-code world, that was governance, right?
Right.
How well do you do governance? Soup to nuts. It's extremely complex. It's always going to be that one of those aspirational things, because we know you needed it, and we knew you were focusing on shinier objects.
So if you think about advice for the vendors here, obviously the wave is this point in time, and then some season goes by. Sometimes it's a year, sometimes 18 months, or then same for the Magic Quadrant, but some variability. Sometimes these things collapse. Sometimes these things collapse and it becomes a new mega category. If you think about
this is a very advice point we need to come back to. Go ahead.
Right. So if you think about advice for the vendor in that period between, it comes out and next time around, this concept's always fascinating to me, where you essentially say, well, imagine if nothing else happened, if all of you vendors stayed the exact same, you didn't build anything new, odds are from one season to the next, the chart moves up and to the right? Because expectations grow. How do you think about, from a vendor's perspective, how should I think about engaging with the analyst firm during that season to try to help influence how that moves, obviously favorably to my vision and strategy, right? But because one thing is, how can I do better at the actual scoring side of it and the criteria side, but the other is, how can I favorably shift the criteria over time to my advantage, right?
Well, there's one thing that a vendor can always do to shift an analyst's perspective, and that's talk to them. There are a number of vendors who show up for the Magic Quadrant or wave process, and then we don't see them until the next one comes out. That's a mistake. And it's not just about we have a new release, right? Or we got a big win. It is about, we see this happening. Customer demand is reflected here and here. We're seeing these requirements coming from our customers. This is our roadmap, typically under non-disclosure. That relationship between the vendor and the analyst is something that people outside that relationship often wonder about. It's a really important one, because vendors are clients, and they would be very well served by exposing their thinking and getting feedback from the analyst for 2 reasons. Number one, of course, maybe the analyst has something useful to say, like, that's a terrible idea. I just talked to a guy who said he needs the exact opposite. Or you just influence the analyst in his thinking about, or her thinking about, what that next one is going to look like. Half a dozen vendors come in and say, clients are increasingly demanding that our governance be such that multiple people can collaborate on it, but one person is in charge, whatever the feature is. If that's being heard and the analyst can say, yeah, you know what, I'm hearing that in my inquiries too, well, there's a new dot on the landscape. I want to come back to something else you said, which
The
is
collapsing of the categories.
yeah. I'd rather think about it in terms of the taxonomy of the market. What are the categories? Because these products are written about categories, right? In the dynamic of the growth of an IT vendor, especially software vendors, over time, there is a natural footprint expansion. I want more wallet share from my customers. Why, if I'm a database vendor, I'll go back to my own space. Why should I let somebody else sell them ETL software to move data in and out from other places? I mean, I'm managing the data. I ought to own that. I'm going to go compete with those guys. I'm going to put that in my own product. Why should I have a governance specialist coming in to manage the metadata associated with the DBMS I'm running? I should do that myself. Now, what happens in a large company like Gartner or Forrester, where there's many analysts writing about many technologies, they can be adjacent to one another. You can go look at Oracle or AWS or Microsoft as a vendor for managing data, and Informatica and Boomi and half a dozen other vendors who sell governance, metadata management, data flow, or you may want to buy it all from one vendor and one platform, whether they break it out into separate products or not. This becomes very complicated. And it's one of the reasons why with the analyst, because sometimes the analyst will say, you might not need another vendor on your list of vendors to manage and pay, because some of the features you're telling me about are right there in a product I know you already have. Have you, in fact, looked? The answer often is no. Many customers have not assessed the stuff they have in the shop right now that could turn out to be perfectly suitable for what they're trying to do. So that holistic view of a set of features is sometimes not well served by these particular research products. It just depends upon the scope that they designed them for.
Rob, one for you on this front.
Mhm.
Very relevant to our audience here around low to no code. Obviously, that's a space that's evolving. And in fact, the classic line I think you would give people is, look, low code or no code, that's an attribute of something. And the something is evolving and changing. Rob, your perspective would be great on the world of low code. Okay, there's forms, there's database, there's workflow, there's websites, there's all manner of mobile applications, things you can build. That space is coalescing. How should the vendor think about that? Because you end up quite often when there's these shifts, Merv, a little bit like you're describing, the shift happens where the buyer starts to say, actually, I want these three things from one place. And all of a sudden I can turn up in a wave where I do one of those things, but the new wave requires all three. And all of a sudden, so now I've got an apples oranges conversation, right? Like, hey, I do really well at mobile form design low code, but you tell me I'm no good at workflow low code. Well, I'm not, because I don't have it, right? Like there's sort of almost that binary thing. So Rob, how do you think about that evolution of that low code space right now, and how this might moving forward manifest in a wave or a magic quadrant?
So it's a really great question, Ryan, and I'm really glad you asked it, because I get to call bullshit on myself and just say what I was looking for, right? Because I think a lot of it, Merv, some of this comes down to, how do I see the market? How do I think it's going to evolve? And how do I think what do the products need to do in order to meet that evolution of the market? So here was Rob's
That's how you and I
contention.
think about it.
Huh? Yeah,
that's how you and I think about it. The customer has
sorry?
a specific requirement.
The customer has a specific requirement, but we have to come up with the average per chips, per chip Gleedman's. Something drives that vision of what put that graphic together, right? So, full disclosure, here's, behind the kimono. Rob's vision of the digital process automation market was, thing number one, digital process automation was two pieces. It was wide and deep. It was the very, very complicated, sophisticated applications, as well as that long tail of applications. And there was the low code market that was coming into it. My contention, my hypothesis was that over time, organizations will try to get as much value out of a single platform as they can, try to cover as much waterfront of their application development portfolio as they can with a single purchase, and that they will start to fit in other things there. That may not be what you were looking to buy. So it's really important for you to understand when you look at a Rob Koplowitz digital process automation wave, what was in the upper right hand was the most comprehensive solution on the market that could hit those three things: build a lot of white workflow applications, build sophisticated workflow applications, and potentially become a foundational component for your low code capabilities. Now, that might not be what you were trying to buy. So I was earlier when you said, how do I move up into the right? That's how you move up into the right in Rob's wave, which is, the airing of the grievances. The people in the upper right tend to be of a wave. The airing of the grievances. They tend to be the most full-featured comprehensive solutions. We may not be the answer for you. Why do we call them leaders? They're not leaders. They're more comprehensive. They're more full-featured. At least in every wave I did and everybody else's waves that were people I knew. The people in the lower left, Ryan, we're working with one right now. Can we name them?
Yep.
Maybe not. I don't know. We can?
Nah, I don't think
All right.
that.
We're working with a vendor who was traditionally found in the lower left corner of a Forrester wave, who does something very specific, does not build things that are required in order to meet that need, and is an outstanding product for people who are looking for what they do. Then they have fabulous focus.
One of the hardest client inquiry conversations is the one where the first thing the analyst says after hearing out what the discussion is about is, you're asking the wrong question. You have a client on the other end of the phone who is looking for a very point solution, something that's very tactical, that has immediate business value to the project that's on their desk. And everything you know about the space, and maybe even about that customer's business more broadly, because you may have a relationship with them that goes on for years, is this is a terrible idea. Don't add yet another tiny point product that now needs to be managed along with the other 5 things you have that do this same thing. Tools in most sizable companies is in double digits, right? Because every time they have a new problem, they go buy a new product for it instead of thinking about whether they can use the one they've got. But that creates additional architectural challenges beyond the vendor management space. It's how do these things share information with one another? If I set up a set of rules in this one, are those same rules applied when this other thing works? If I define things a certain way in this one, are those definitions shareable? And the answer typically is no. And so you get what a lot of people love to refer to as technical debt. It's out there, it's functioning. We're servicing that debt, but it's still debt. It's unfinished business, right? We're not doing this right. And here's the fun thing about the analyst job, Ryan. Sometimes you give that tough love answer to the client, and we get evaluated on the quality of our responses to clients. When you tell them what they don't want to hear, they don't necessarily give you a good review, and you might have done an outstanding job of telling them what they needed to know.
If we think about, looking to sort of move this towards what does the future look like and wrap up our time together today. But if you think about, there's just this obvious tension, right? So to spell it out, it becomes Gartner says, or Forrester, I don't want to pick on anyone, but hey, here's this thing. And we full well know you're going to use it to pick your product in your RFP process, but we're going to say, no, that's not what it's for. But pay the money, buy it, and use it for that. But that's not what it's for. And the buyer should be being more critical about it, but is saying, frankly, I'm going to look for, and no one got fired for buying the leader, right? Because buying B2B SaaS is a dangerous proposition for a buyer if you get it wrong. And then on the vendor side, it literally becomes like going to war, like prep for war. With this thing, I'm going to go into this process and do this thing and score this thing and run it back and forward. And you're going to send me my thing, and I'm going to demand a higher score, and that'll be antagonistic. And if I don't like it, my boss will call your boss, and all this kind of stuff goes on, right?
Eventually,
and then not naming.
All be professional.
Yeah. okay, it's going to come out. I now have to, Rob and I were talking about this the other day. Okay, I've got to put together my FAQ for my internal folks. I've got to do sales readiness. We've got to have a town hall where we talk about this thing coming out, and the dot's going to be here, and we feel great about it or bad about it. And there'll be a press release if we feel good, and there'll be a blog post that'll be the sort of weird roundabout. We don't see the world the way they see it if they score us in this category. That's what actually happens.
Yes.
And it's staggering. I think if I was to, I'm sure you both know because you've spent enough time and you've built friendships with people on the other side. I think a lot of analysts and the firms don't realize just how much work. If I was to count the number of hours and the cost to respond to one of these things, and the flow across the business is massive. How do we solve
that side of the desk too, professionally, in addition to being
So
Right.
have I. I've responded to
how do we
wave
solve for that?
MQs.
Yeah. How do we get past that? Like, what's the answer to what's the future of an MQ, a wave, or some new analyst firm spins up and they come out with what we think the right approach to this is? Like, how do we get to that?
With talk, right? You have the conversation. I've done many, many vendor engagements or just inquiries, because an engagement is longer. Inquiry is time limited. Where the conversation was about, all right, well, given how would you advise us to go to market? Now that you've said what you've said, how would you respond to a client if they come in saying, well, Gartner didn't put you in the upper right? And I was more than happy to sit with a client and say, well, here are the strengths that we identified, and yeah, we did identify those things as weaknesses. My best guidance to you is, if that's the thing the customer wants the most, find another customer. But if not, right, then, here are the strengths that Gartner identified that we have. Here's where we're really good, and they'll acknowledge it. And by the way, now that you've heard that from me, that if they're a client, they can call me and I'll tell them the same thing I told you. That can work.
So
Nothing is perfect.
More airing of the grievances, Brian?
It's Festivus again. Okay, yeah.
All right.
So that's the beauty when you're a retired analyst. You can.
No, right. I was going to say, Merv, it was the beauty of being an analyst. You'd go into a day of advisory and you'd say, you should build this and build this and build this, and then you go home. So now I get to do that.
We just advise. Yeah, I remember that commercial.
I get to do this as an ex-analyst. If I could wave a magic wand and say, how would product selection and vendor evaluations be handled in a better world? Number one, I would get rid of the term leader. I just don't think that represents a leader. I would sort of say that the scale is fundamentally different. Number two, I would try to address the fact that it is a point in time evaluation, right? It should be more real time, right? It should be more like you're going out to a restaurant and you look at Yelp, right? If a vendor releases a significant piece of functionality, I would love there to be a way for that to be incorporated into the evaluation in near real time. You've built it. Show me you've built it. It goes into the model. Now, that starts to muck around with their business model, right? Because they like to sell those reprints to the leaders, and the leaders want that thing to last for a long time. The other thing I would say is we've got that beautiful model, but let's acknowledge this here. Not everybody uses the model. Even if you are a Forrester client, you're not necessarily accessing the model, don't know how to use it. And if you're one of those folks who is just getting the thing as a reprint through a vendor who's touting their position, you don't even have the model, right? So what I would love is you go in and you say, these are the 34 criteria that we evaluated. Before you ever look at anything, is this important to you? How important? How are you going to use it? Number two, is this important? Like almost a wizard-driven thing that then shows you your grid. And by the way, if I could break the log jam so that it wasn't 15 vendors, because I know darn well there were a heck of a lot more than 15 vendors that were relevant to the market. Reimer and I tracked 116 vendors in the low-code DPA space. I would do that as well. There's 116 vendors that we track. They work in collaboration with us. Here's your 34 questions at the end of it. this is our evaluation of what the vendors you should look at. That's my wave a magic wand. He's an idiot and doesn't know what he's just asked for. He has no idea how much work and why that's impossible. But I get to ask for anything I want because I'm a podcaster.
I'm gonna boil it down to 3 words that the client should have in their head: do your homework.
Yeah.
Even if they're a client of one of our former firms, often they haven't even done that. I cannot tell you how many inquiries I took in the early cloud days from people who jumped on. I'm going to pick on a vendor here, not because they're bad, but because of the way the timing worked out. Snowflake made their name very early as the cloud native DBMS. That was their marketing positioning. And it had a little bit of value because they were new and they were specifically designed for the cloud, blah, blah, blah. I can't tell you how many inquiries I took from clients when I said to them, who else did you look at? They said, oh, nobody. They're the only cloud native DBMS. And there was enough truth in the statement that it was reasonable, but that didn't mean there weren't other vendors who could have done what that customer was trying to do. The point is, this is one of many tools available to a buyer. They should not just make sure that they use it, but they should also use it as it should be used. Go to the next step. Create their own set of criteria weightings that map whatever that analyst firm said to what they really want, and then go out and do the homework to validate, whether or not even the analyst firm might have gotten it wrong, or things have changed since that 10-month-old document was published, for example. There is no substitute for just doing the work yourself.
Brilliant.
I think it's a fantastic place to wrap it up, Merv, the do your homework, which is challenging these days because there's a lot for people to take care of. But look, really want to thank you for jumping on this and setting that scene, I think, across the board for the vendor, for the buyer, even, and for the analyst on the other side. It's a challenging space, and I think anything anyone can do to help with that's appreciated. If people want to reach out to you, Merv, have discussions around this, maybe get some guidance and coaching, what's the best way to get hold of you?
You can find me at itmarketstrategy.com. That's my website. And I'm not really doing all that much work these days with user clients, but I'm always happy to talk to somebody who wants to reach out. You can find me there. You can find contact information. You can find out when and where I'm going to be places, and even some music clips if you're so inclined.
Fantastic.
I was hoping
appreciate you sharing that musical talent. And so I think, close any parting words, Rob, and then I think I have a nice close out with a perspective from the other side of the fence to maybe help people on their own journey.
My closing words are just, Merv, anytime I can spend time with you, it's just, I love it. So thank you so much for coming.
Back at you, buddy. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. So the closeout offer is that it's called analyst relations for a reason. The R is important, Merv, to your point. I think for anybody out there, the marquee, what you should aim for if you're on the vendor side, is that you end up in a situation that I've been afforded where I can be good friends with the people from the analyst side as opposed to an adversary across the chair from them. And I think if you can think about how you build that relationship over time through that open dialogue, then you'll be far better placed. So with that, thanks for joining us, everybody. Episode 4 is a wrap, and we look forward to catching you on the next one.
Thanks, everybody.